This is live from my office. Welcome again to a new season of my favorite podcast, or at least my favorite podcast from this office. Thus the title, Live from My Office. If you're not listening to me on the radio, I hope you'll start. And I appreciate you listening here. I really do. Every morning on the radio from 5:30 to 9 on the Big 890 WLS in Chicago, on smart devices everywhere, and streamed everywhere as well. And as always, I appreciate your support. Going to talk to Dr. Deborah Birx today. Now, she was on the radio with me before, and her book from last year is called Silent Invasion, The Untold Story of the Trump Administration, COVID-19, and Preventing the Next Pandemic Before It's Too Late. Here's the good news. She tells me in this interview that we have the tools to beat it and to handle it, and we're really only in jeopardy a matter of a few weeks a year. And this is my words, not hers now, if we would just get our collective heads out of our collective asses and grow up and act like we don't know everything, and we ought to be listening to the experts. But again, hey, that's just me. So here's the situation. You'll hear the Dr. Birx interview, and then it will go away until the next time when I have something kind of exciting up my sleeve, or at least I think it is. There's a crisis of faith in this country, and that crisis of faith needs to be dealt with in a real and serious, timely manner. And by that, we need to know exactly how we get people to believe again and to have faith. And whether it's going back into church or possibly just finding faith and spirituality in their own lives. I think it's important, and I hope you do as well. In the meantime, we will take that on in the next episode of Live from My Office. Again, this is a podcast that could not happen without support of great sponsors like Team Hochberg and Cantini Golf in the past, and now our friends at the Rao Center for the Performing Arts, where we've done our New Year's Eve show, I don't know how many times. We've got another show coming up on Father's Day later this year. But the Rao folks are great. And let me just get a plug in here for a show we'll be doing shortly, as a matter of fact. 2 weeks away, just about let's make it 3 weeks away to get it right. It's Sunday night, January 29th, 6 o'clock at Zany's in Rosemont. We'll be recording the show for an upcoming special, and we hope you can be there. Who's performing? It's the Forefathers. It's Mike Toomey from Channel 9. It's Tim Benker. It's John DeCause, musical director of the Steve Cochran Show. Very funny guy. And me. And we hope you can come out 6 o'clock, early show, because it's a school night, 6 o'clock on Sunday night. That's the 29th of January. Get your tickets at rosemont.zanies.com, or just Google up Steve Cochran, January 29th, Zanies, Rosemont, or Google up Forefathers. There's lots of ways for you to find it. You know, we have listeners around the world who listen to Live from My Office. How many? The number is huge. But how about in Germany, in Canada, in Israel, in the United Kingdom, Spain, Malawi, India, Italy, Taiwan, Egypt and France, Mexico and Panama, Colombia, Aruba, and Jamaica, just to name a few. So from the great Midwest to Malawi and back, welcome again to Live from My Office. Subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen, and I'm happy to have you here. All right, Dr. Birx and I discussing our collective futures and how we save ourselves from ourselves in some ways when we come back on Live from My Office. Live from My Office is sponsored in part by the Rao Center in Crystal Lake. This is an amazing theater. Opened back in 1929 and did movies and vaudeville in its early days. It was very exciting. The new talkies were on stage. A lot of people think of the Forefathers, our stand-up tour that we're doing. We're the talkies now. Some people wish we would stop talking. But I love the Rao Theater, and I love its history, and I love that the good people of Crystal Lake have made it a part, really a centerpiece of downtown Crystal Lake as well. By the way, it's named after a woman named Lucille Rao, who lived and worked most of her life in the 4 square block downtown Crystal Lake area. left a nice monetary gift on her passing to Crystal Lake, and the town decided to rename the theater after her. She was shy. She wouldn't have enjoyed that while she was amongst us, but it was a nice thing for her family, and that's why it's called the Rouse Center, welcoming through the years Tony, Academy, and Grammy Award winners, as well as dopes like me. So if you'd like to find out more about the Rouse Center, we always encourage you to go to the Rouse Center website, where they can give you all the information you need. Or you can call the box office anytime or ask for information there too at 815-356. That's 815-356. 815. I've got it. I promise you I've got it. That's 815-356-9212. The Rouse Center, 26 North William Street in Crystal Lake. And don't forget about the School for the Arts for your kids, or maybe for you, coming up in 2023, all sorts of good things. And John DeCause will be teaching a comedy class there as well. And now back to Live from My Office. All right, joining me now, and it's an honor to have her on the program again, is Dr. Deborah Birx. And we're going to talk about your book and talk about your life, but I hope you had a nice holiday.
Had a great holiday. We're still doing our internal COVID protocols, so no one has gotten COVID despite BBX 1.5, and just goes to show that you can gather and do things and still not spread COVID.
You know, when we met in studio, one of the things that struck me about you, and you know this to be true, anybody that lives a public life, people think they know you and they think they have an image of you. And I was struck by a couple of things. One, that, my gosh, you're a regular person, mother of daughters, and a warm individual who happens to have lived a very interesting life and got thrown into this without being asked.
Yeah, no, I've had a very fabulous life. It just goes to show you that sometimes if you overly map out your life, you're not open to opportunities and events as they occur. And certainly I ended up in places I never thought I would be. And I got the opportunity to do things that I didn't think even those institutions afforded people those opportunities.
Sure.
So that has been great.
You know, you came into play as a national figure here after having spent, 28 years? Do I have that right, in the military?
29 years in the military and almost 40 years in government before I ended up in the White House, which I considered a great success that I kept out of there for 40 years. I worked with a lot of presidents, but I never had to go inside.
Yeah, and you had a particularly good relationship, which I was pleased to see, with President Bush, George W. Bush.
I hope I have good relationships with all of the past presidents.
Yeah, well, but the reason of bringing up Bush is, and I think you speak to this in the book if I remember correctly, but he was a good sounding board when things got weird. We'll get to that in a second.
Yes.
But the book we keep referencing is The Untold Story of the Trump Administration, COVID-19, and Preventing the Next Pandemic Before It's Too Late. It's in silent invasion, and I have read, because I have to, it's part of the job, all of the books that have come out related to COVID to date of significance. And I just think you've done something here that nobody else has done, and told the story without blame, with facts. And one of the reasons I know it's factual is in the town of Washington, people would jump at you if it wasn't.
That's absolutely correct. And I'm very proud, although I had to read through the proofs about 6 times. We had no big errors in the writing, but more importantly, no big errors in the numbers, which was really important to me. I'm very data oriented. I believe that data really speaks to me like words and music speaks to other people. Sure. So it was really important to me that I got it right. And I also wanted to correct misperceptions, because what's really important in pandemics is to understand what went well and what didn't go well, and then to fix those things. And because we're still finger pointing, we're still not fixing the things that we need to fix in order to be ready for the next pandemic. And frankly, to keep this one and get this one under some kind of control.
Yeah, and well, listen, everybody wants to talk to you about Trump. We could talk about Trump forever. Certainly, I have well-known opinions about Trump, but I think you're very honest here about not just where mistakes were made in the Oval Office, but the overall pattern of mistakes that need to be corrected going forward. And I'm not trying to give you or anybody else a break here, but this was truly unprecedented. And you were acting on a daily, hour-to-hour basis while fighting political agendas and things of that nature. As you look back on this, and maybe this isn't even included in the book at large, are there things that you maybe even daily say, if I knew then what I know now, I would have done this? Or do you choose not to live in that space?
No, the reason I believe I ended up in the White House is because I had on the ground experience with really working with pandemics and knew how and what you had to do to get pandemics under some type of control. And I look back now, 40 years later, at the AIDS pandemic, which still is not zero today. I mean,
That's
just
true.
to be absolutely clear. But if you look at the United States, the death rate over 40 years of HIV infection is only about 70, I say that only. It's about 800,000 Americans have died from HIV in this country and 1.1 million from COVID in the last 3 years. So 40 years versus 3 years. In my mind, it says to me, when we were battling, and certainly that's what I dedicated a lot of my life to, is battling HIV and HIV, TB, and malaria, and then Ebola and Zika and everything else that came up with those things. We took every infection and every death as a failure of our implementation. And that's how you change the course of pandemics. You don't accept the status quo. And I think, and because of that, all through the last 40 years of HIV, we've constantly innovated in programs by talking to communities on the ground and adjusting the program and continuing every year to make better tools to prevent HIV. Sure. And we have been stagnant in the US in our innovation since those original days of COVID. So if anything, I'm disappointed that we don't continue to innovate.
And that's maybe the most important message to get out as an umbrella over all of this. But I also think it's crucial because it ties to something I brought up to you in our initial meeting on the radio show. And that is my grave concern about the time we live in and the death of expertise. That's not right. The death of respect for experts in this country, calling into account what you know or don't know, what Dr. Fauci knows or doesn't know, what the CDC may or may not know. And I use this analogy with you before. I've used it a million times. I'll say it again. I don't get on an airplane and knock on the cockpit door and say, hey, I saw a YouTube video. I'll take it from here. You spend 40 years in the field doing this. Are you concerned about this experts don't know as much as I know thing that's going on?
I think that happens, and it happened in HIV. I mean, I'm going to be very frank.
Right?
In the early 80s, there was so much misinformation about how HIV was passed and what treatments were effective. There were a lot of treatments put out there in social media, in the social media of that day, which was much more about telephones than anything else.
Right.
Where word of mouth said this worked and this didn't work. And so that's very common in pandemics. But the way you combat that is to sit down with people and listen to their concerns, because usually that misinformation stems out of fear, or people feel like they don't have control over the virus or how it's spread. And I think if I've learned anything in 40 years, it's empower people with knowledge so they feel like and they can exercise control over viruses and bacteria. And we can. That's the thing, we can. And I think it's not only that people don't respect the experts, it's frankly that who's ever in charge in Washington doesn't respect all Americans and their opinions. If we had decided that, well, we knew that the highest risk for HIV and the early years was men that have sex with men.
Right.
If we had decided, okay, well, we're just going to tell men not to have sex anymore. No, we found solutions that worked for the individual. And I think Instead of doing that, we've tried to justify our inaction, or we've tried to justify the deaths by acting like it's solely politically driven, that people are making their life and death decisions based on whether they voted Republican and Democrat. And I can tell you that's not true, having traveled this country. It's really structural barriers that have to be addressed so that we're in a better place. And I'm so worried every day, because every day we get deeper and deeper into this hole of saying, oh, it's the anti-vaxxers, or it's this, or it's that. Well, you know what? Get there on the ground where people are dying and figure it out, because it's not that simple. And it's not that they're anti-vaxxers, is that there's no primary care in rural America anymore. So, us, by making it political, it is almost justifying both sides for not addressing the current pandemic. And I just find that unacceptable.
Unacceptable and dangerous, right?
Exactly. I mean, 400 to 500 people are dying every day. We're going to lose more people in the next 8 weeks than we lost in the whole flu season. Yet we acted like this is flu. It is not flu. I want to be totally clear. It never was flu.
Right.
And when we trivialize this virus, that is not a trivial thing. I think all of us just recently saw what happened with our fabulous Al Roker, when he developed clots 2 months later. This is the risk to COVID. It is not something simple that you acutely survive the illness and then everything is fine. It can have deep complications. And if we don't inform people about their risks so they can be aware and look for them, we're doing a disservice to every American. And so I don't know why we continue to ignore these things. I have found, no matter where I have worked, if you come up with common sense solutions in partnership with communities, you can change the course of pandemics. Very interesting in what China said about the travel restrictions. They said nothing needs to be done because we have this under control. And I think that's the way they look at pandemics. To me, that was very telling, that if they think they've got things under control, there's no reason for the world to react at all. And I think that that's what kept them silent back in December 2019 and January 2020, is they felt like they had things under control, and clearly they didn't. And again, they think they have it under control, and they didn't.
And it's very dangerous. And is that an explosion of the statement that Trump made? And there's a million of them. The statement that Trump made that always made me craziest was, well, if we tested less, we'd have less cases. That just insane. But that denial that China politicizes on this massive level, I mean, it's really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way they only have 5,000 people dead.
Oh my God, no.
I mean, it's just, but I think as a global community, WHO should be calling a spade and say, hey, no. Right. You put the world at risk, and you're doing it again. You did it with SARS. You did it with COVID 3 years ago. You're doing it now. And you're just, it's Chinese New Year. Millions and millions and millions of Chinese are going to be everywhere, respreading. And remember, people can get reinfected within weeks. So I'm like, you may give us a double hump to our what would have been a single curve. I mean, it's just, to me, it's crazy. But as long as you keep things in that political realm, and you act like it's because what party they support, rather than the fact of where they live. I mean, people understand that live in Oklahoma, that they could be 3 hours from any healthcare. They get that, but no one's addressing that. I mean, we have people today that do Meals on Wheels and Meals on Wheels in rural areas. We could be paying them to going to every household that has people over 65 and make sure they have the test and the mask, and they have the information that they need. We have community support organizations that could come in and help, like we did with HIV. But instead, we continue to just talk from microphones and try to beat people over the head, rather getting in there and using service organizations that are already dedicated to reaching individuals who have been very difficult to reach, and getting them the information and the tools that they need in order to survive. And then we can talk about people thriving, but let's just get to the place where every American can survive.
Well, that's the key, right? Because you have the immediate term problem, the middle term solution, and the long-term solution. And the long-term solution is figuring out the big picture end of how to deal with future pandemics. The middle term is having that prevention in place, but the immediacy is survive. Do people know what to ask for in your travels around the country? Because I know you got in the car, you drove around the country.
And I still do.
Do they know what to ask for, and do they know who to ask?
No. And I think that's what is very disturbing to me. So I spent the last year really talking with nursing homes and making sure that they have the data, but more importantly, making people aware that 35 million Americans that are still significantly vulnerable to COVID do not live in nursing homes. They live in communities. And if we don't figure out how to get them the information that they need and the resources and tools that they need in order to survive, we'll continue to have these death rates. And what I know from battling other pandemics is if you figure this one out and develop a roadmap for how to interact with Americans, no matter where they live and no matter what their political background and values are, if you fix it and you fix COVID, you'll be ready for the next pandemic. Instead, we want to just skip over it because it's messy and it's difficult.
Sure.
We want to pretend it's okay, but it's not okay.
Well, I mean, I guess if that's a legacy from your work in your book, that would be it, right? That's what you'd like people to get out of Silent Invasion and the work you've done and the work you continue to do is learn from the mistakes that have been made, but also from the data we collect every day.
Yeah. So what we're doing today is we're evolving back to exactly the place that got us in trouble 3 years ago. So we're not collecting data in real time. We're not reporting in real time. I know what to look for now, so I can still keep my family very much abreast and know what to do. But the average American can't. I mean, you've got to look at relative slopes of who's being hospitalized. You can't rely on test positivity anymore. You can't rely on the case reporting anymore. So we have an old parallel system that, I continue to do data analysis every single day because it's important to me to continue to get the message out that we do have the tools and the capacity to change the course of COVID in the United States so that we don't have 500 deaths a day and so that we don't have 4 million people on long-term disability because of long COVID. And we don't have people like Al Roker having heart attacks and clots and strokes. We have a way to fix all of that. We are very innovative. Americans are amazing, but we have to talk to people and then express things in common sense terms and not at the national level, at the local level where people live.
Well, talk to me for a second about the messaging, because we in the media at large can certainly do a better job of it instead of going to the bright, shiny thing and yelling about Trump or yelling about Republicans and Democrats, taking the limited time we have and getting the message out that's actually going to help people. So this show, what should I be telling people?
I think telling people very clearly that all of these surges are predictable. We've been through 3 years of winter surges and 2 years, now approaching 3, of summer surges. So we know exactly what this virus is going to do. And so it's about telling people when you hear, and when we have those community support organizations that are people that trust, you can't just, parachute in. You need to use organizations that have established trust in communities, whether that's the church, whether that's people like Meals on Wheels, whether that's elder care, community centers, whatever it is, and every community has those things, is arm them with the information and the tools. So if it's mask and tests or better air quality, whatever it is, and then a hotline where they can call to get Paxlovid. And what I think Americans don't realize today is we have less tools right now to combat COVID, both hospitalizations and deaths, than we did 12 months ago. And that's a failure of our research complex. We don't have monoclonal antibodies. We don't have the long-acting monoclonal antibodies. It's like we got frozen in time in 2020, and we created the tools for 2020 and then never evolved them. And don't tell me just changing the variant on the vaccine is good, because now we have very clear data that within a few weeks, 75% of people are resusceptible to reinfection. So get us a more durable vaccine, get us durable monoclonals, get us additional antivirals. If we had halted our research like we have done with COVID, with HIV, people would still be dying of HIV at extraordinarily high rates. So we have a roadmap that's successful. Sure. And we're not using it. And that's what was so frustrating, and frankly, why I wrote the book, because I was like, how many times do we have to relearn the things that we learned in the 80s and 90s?
Well, and the tragedy here is how many people have to die. I mean, we'll never be able to quantify the exact number that have died because of politics or because of refusal to step forward and move on the knowledge that we have. But that mistake is still being made every day, and it's costing lives.
Every day. And instead of people arguing about mandates and non-mandates, let's just argue about educate. And let's make sure that we're all responsible for getting the information out there that empowers Americans to protect themselves and their family. They will do it. I have seen it. I have seen it in the most rural areas of, Elko, Nevada, to the most urban areas of New York City. People will do the right thing to protect themselves and their family if you provide them the information that they need.
If we can't depend on national politicians, and by the way, I don't think that's your first call to make, do we appeal locally? The hula hoop theory, as I call it, stand in the hula hoop.
All local. It's all local.
So your local medical
local.
Directors, right?
Yes.
Your local health directors.
And your local community support organizations, because not everybody trusts their health provider. Not everybody does. We wish they did, but they don't. But they often will trust their community support organizations that have been there for them, and have been there before COVID and will be there after COVID. And what we learned from HIV is if you fund them directly and you give them the tools, they will be your foot soldiers. They will get out the information. They will get it out with clarity. They will answer people's questions. And that's what you want. You want people to be educated. You never, at this point, 3 years in, we should never be talking about mandates. We should only be talking about educate, and use those influencers that people trust.
Again, the book's called Silent Invasion. I want you to get it and read it. I'm not going to give it away to you by telling everything that's in it, but there's some really fascinating things that you didn't know and still don't know from what you experienced in real time. And when I picked up the book, and prior to meeting you, and certainly after I read it, my initial assumption was, well, you were victimized to some extent by sexism that exists in DC and in politics and other things. But as a 28-year Army officer, I'm sure you've worked for plenty of blowhard men and certainly know how to handle yourself in that circumstance. So when you came across men who maybe were dismissive during that, it seems to be, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, so obviously correct me here if I'm wrong, it seems to be there were a lot of people, for the greater good, were trying to work around those who were more concerned with their political agenda. It was almost like, and I think you sort of make the statement in the book, the less we do, the less we can get blamed on. And then there was this secondary level of folks who worked with you to work around those folks too.
Yeah, when you have worked almost every country in the world, and now in every state in the United States, you learn how to adjust to different leadership. You have to. When I needed the president of Uganda to take seriously the spread of the virus among LGBT communities, among high-risk young women, among sex workers, among prisoners, I had to bring the data and work one-on-one behind the scenes. That is not something that you can get the policy changes that you need by, frankly, going to the newspaper. I've made amazing progress in policies around the world working one-on-one with leaders. And I believe that that's done in a closed door setting. I know that that's very frustrating to many people who think everything should be in the media. But when you want a leader to make tough decisions, you have to do that one-on-one. And I think it early on that was successful in the Trump administration. We got the 15 days to slow the spread. We got the 30 additional days to slow the spread. And we never had to do that again because we had more tools to actually prevent spread. And then we worked at the governor level when it was clear that President Trump had moved on. And, I will hit my head against that wall for a while, but then I'll find another way or make one. So you don't stop, you just find another way or make one. You don't give up on the American people. And I think it doesn't matter what pandemic I'm working on, I never give up on the local people. I have always been impressed by communities and what they're willing to do to support one another.
Do we need to accept the fact that there will be another one? Maybe it's not in your lifetime or my lifetime, but there will be another pandemic?
Well, we need to accept the fact that we're going to continue to have these COVID surges with acute consequences, as you well described. There's acute consequences to a COVID surge with loss of very vulnerable and elderly Americans. There's medium and long-term consequences to COVID infection. And I think if we wanted to be ready for the next pandemic, we have to do what is needed to stop this one in a way that minimizes death and minimizes what we would call medium and long-term COVID by giving people the information that they need to be successful. And I think we still fail at that every single day.
I brought up President Bush initially, and let me just circle back before we run out of time, because I'm already over the time. I promised you I'd let you go and live your life. We're recording this on a Saturday, so I appreciate your patience. But there's so much good stuff here that I really want people to know so they can get the book Silent Invasion if their family didn't buy it for them for Christmas, and shame on them. And the question is this: when you look back on your work, there's two people that jump out in your world that we all think of initially. One is Trump, of course. The other is Dr. Anthony Fauci, who just retired, though anybody that knows him on any level doesn't believe he's retired. He's going to come back in some form. I'm sure working as closely as you did in the tense situations you had, you probably bumped heads on some things. But what is it you'd like to say about Dr. Fauci, or what is it we don't know that maybe we should?
I think what, people have really focused on his science and his drive. And I think that's absolutely true. But I knew Dr. Fauci before HIV, and I knew him as a young woman in the early 80s as one of his fellows. And I really try to make this point each time. He never had any gender issues. And you can imagine in the 80s, there were quite a few.
Sure. That's
people
an
that did have gender issues.
82-year-old man who comes from a generation where gender issues were just part of the day.
And this was before he had two beautiful, fabulous, bright young women as daughters. This was before he was married. And so he really had tremendous influence on me early. I always wanted to be a researcher. I was always data driven. And what Dr. Fauci taught me, three critical things in my early years. One, that you do research to translate that into action at the bedside that saves people's lives. And you don't do research just to publish in the New England Journal or Nature or Science. You do the hard work because it needs to get from the bench to the bedside. Secondly, he had amazing empathy and compassion for his patients. And that was really what drove the research. He could see the devastation of many of these diseases on individuals, and that drove him to get the science and the innovation right. And I think his empathy for patients is really extraordinary. And the third thing that always impressed me is obviously Dr. Fauci also ran a laboratory. And so he had what was equivalent to postdocs and researchers in his lab that were junior. When we would go to national meetings, he would alter his schedule so that he could be available to hear those junior people present. He would be in the front row. He would be there as a support system. He would be there to show that he believed in those individuals. And you're kind of nervous when you're presenting in these big meetings.
Sure.
And he was there. And I've watched a lot of other leaders who go to national meetings and they use that as an opportunity to meet up with their colleagues. People who are of their same age or their same place in society. Not Dr. Fauci. He took the time to make sure that he was at all of his lab, and he had a big lab, all of those presentations. And I watched him and learned from him. And so I think people talk about his his leadership in public health and science, but it was really those fundamental qualities of understanding why you have a purpose to do this work, who the work is for, having compassion for them, and then having compassion for people who are very junior and just learning from you and knowing that you have to be an example to them. And so that was really important to me. And he said one thing to me, because I was hard driving and very,
Sure.
I don't take no for an answer. So I'm like very hard. I'm a very hard
Got that
worker
impression.
and hard driving. And I was very upset because one of my manuscripts in the early 80s got rejected by the New England Journal of Medicine. And to me, this was like, oh, my career is over.
Right.
And he looked at me and he said, Debbie, they don't put your CV and everything you published on your tombstone.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, wow, yeah. That was a big wow for me, because we get caught up into the day-to-day little things that we think are life-defining. And then we realize that, they're not going to put on my tombstone that I had to go into the Trump administration and made that sacrifice. That was a sacrifice, but I knew the downside. So I went in with my eyes open.
And what a good life lesson. What a good life lesson from Fauci.
That's totally.
And lastly, and again, Silent Invasion's the book. We'll give you the full title in a second. Get 2 copies. You're careless. You know how you are. You lose one. You're very honest in the book. This is not, I said at the top, it's not a Trump bashing book. There's plenty of those if you want them. But in it, you talk very truthfully about the experience that you had on Disinfectant Day, for lack of a better way of putting it. I had a sense, because of your military career, after I had a sense of knowing it, that there's a code. You don't question a superior officer in public. You do it behind closed doors. You did that behind closed doors with some success and some hangups on the phone. But is there some way you would have handled that differently as you look back? Because I'm sure you're asked about it constantly.
Well, I try in my life, obviously I'm not perfect, but I always tell my daughters and anybody that I've mentored that, you have to, there are moments in life where you will make a mistake. Mm-hmm. Your failure is if you don't learn from that. Mm-hmm. And that occurred in mid-March. That never happened again. So I made sure that didn't happen again. And, I think what has always been distressing about that moment to me is obviously, and Alyssa Farah has talked about this subsequently, someone took that DHS male scientist, Dr. Bryant, into the Oval Office, unbeknownst to me, because they sent me down to stand outside the press briefing room. I stood there for 45 minutes waiting for the president to come. Clearly, that DHS scientist was encouraging him in this idea. Now, I don't know who else was in the Oval Office. I wasn't. But whoever was in that Oval Office, because that's a private setting, should have been telling the president that this is not a treatment. They show up because I'm thinking that we have this DHS scientist because I want kids to get out into playgrounds. And I want to prove to parents that the playground equipment is safe. And when they come into the briefing room, and the only thing that's really been disappointing with me and the media is when they came into the briefing room, the president's back was turned to me and he was continuing his dialogue with that DHS scientist, a male. But almost all the audio of that dialogue has been cut out with the implication that he was talking to me. And he wasn't facing me, he wasn't talking to me. And I think, if it ever happened again, I would have gotten between the DHS scientist and the president and said, this is not a treatment, which when he turned to me, I did say that. But I think, that's a true lesson learned. Obviously, I'm very respectful of chain of command in public, as you described. I've had very, deep discussions with generals and presidents and prime ministers about what I think is right. And I have to say, about 75 to 80% of the time, I'm able to convince them to do what's right from the policy standpoint. And I think, after that moment, but even before that, when people could see that the task force was able to convince the president on these policies, they didn't let the task force see the president anymore, because there was a whole group of individuals in that White House that were just like the January 6 lawyers that came into the White House that convinced the president and was there every day saying to him, don't worry about COVID, don't worry about COVID. It's not a big deal, don't worry about COVID. We've talked to other experts and they said not to worry about COVID. Just like, they made up about Vice President Pence being able to do this in Congress.
Yeah.
So to me, January 6th is a reflection of how that White House was run, and their COVID response is a reflection. And although there are people that helped me, just like there were people that told him that he had lost the election, he chose the road that he went down. And sometimes when that happens, you have to find another way to save American lives, and that's why I went out into the field and out to the states. And all of the governors were extraordinarily good all through 2020 in really supporting the policies that were needed to really change COVID in state by state.
And that, I'll leave it at that. Silent Invasion, again, is the book, The Untold Story of the Trump Administration, COVID-19, and Preventing the Next Pandemic Before It's Too Late. But I would encourage people to read because of the honesty, the work the CDC needs to do better, the World Health Organization, the failures to understand basic data collection and what to do with it, all those things that could have made such a big difference in the early days. And a surprising passage, too, about Vice President Pence and Jared Kushner and how they quietly worked behind the scenes to do the right thing, which was interesting for me to read. And I won't give it away, but George W. Bush had an interesting conversation with you. I'm a fan of his, by the way, and encouraged you on one of your most frustrating days, which I think was an interesting story too. I salute your work and your honesty. So, I know you're not the type to fall into this trap, but it is an honor to talk to you. And I want to thank you for the work you continue to do. And I guess I'm most amazed as I look at this Zoom call and this beautiful home behind you that you're sitting in, that everything isn't covered with plastic wrap and you're not in full disease uniform, because you know all the bad stuff. You're living your life. You're doing it the right way, and we can too. But be smart and reach out to your community health organizations. Be a leader and make sure your home and your community are healthy first.
Thank you, Steve. Really great talking with you.
Live from my office on the Steve Cochran Show. You get live from my office wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you for that. This is always produced by Ross Cochran, doing a wonderful job. And thank you, Ross, for that. And the radio show is on the Big 89 WLS, Monday through Friday, 5:30 to 9. We're bringing back radio show highlights. For those of you who only get to listen here, we'll have those highlights for you every Wednesday, starting with the next episode of Live from My Office. So for those of you who aren't getting up or don't listen to the radio with any regularity, I'm first going to need a note from your mother. And secondly, just tell you that you can get weekly highlights from the Steve Cochran Show here. Well, that does it for this time. Thank you again to Dr. Deborah Birx. Get her book, Silent Invasion, and you'll be able to protect your family and your own community a little bit better. And thank you for listening to Live from My Office.
30 years plus on the airwaves, you have turned your dial to me. Now you're tuned into my podcast. It's Live from My Office, Steve. From Ithaca, New York, to Carolina South, W. Cochran Steve. From Minneapolis and then Chicago twice, top rated shows achieved. Sit back, relax, and now listen to my show. When or wherever you are, 'cause you're on the go. A-list celebs with some laughs and great info. Live from my office, the Steve Cochran Podcast Show. Yeah. No better place to be. Yeah. Subscribe and like for free. Yeah. Live from my office, Steve. So glad you're you're with me. It's live from my office.
Thank you for listening to Live from My Office, a service of Monkey Run Productions. All rights reserved. The podcast is hosted by Steve Cochran, and it's mixed, edited, and produced by me, Ross Cochran. Support the show by subscribing wherever you're listening and by telling your friends about it. Follow Steve on all social media channels, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And make sure you check out this episode's show notes for relevant information discussed during the conversations. You can also email the show directly at thecochranshow@gmail.com with any questions or comments, and that's the best place to tell us about your favorite nonprofit so we can make sure we mention them on the next episode. Steve is available for corporate speaking gigs. He would love to MC your event, and occasionally, he's funny. Thank you for listening. Head to cochranshow.com for more.